Okay, folks, hope you're doing well. I'm here to talk a little bit about Hellenistic art. In this particular case, it would probably be ideal if you had already done your West in the World reading at this point. So you might want to stop and do that. But if you don't have time for that and you want to go ahead and soldier on, I'll just say this. When we talk about something being Hellenistic or the Hellenistic period, we're talking about the period of time really from the career of Alexander the Great, who died in 323 BCE, to something about like 31 BCE. Okay, so it's roughly a 300-year period, and it comes right on the heels of the classical period. So I thought I'd begin with a couple of works that actually depict Alexander in action, since he's really the one who ushers in this Hellenistic or Greek-like age. Here's a bust of him made quite a bit of time after his life. Here is also a later mosaic depicting Alexander in action at the Battle of Issos. That's Alexander that you can see riding the horse on the left side of the picture. I mentioned that this is a mosaic. We're going to be looking at a number of mosaics in this course. So I wanted to give you an up-close look at what a mosaic really is. It's made up, it's not a painting at all. It's made up of these little tesserae, these little pieces of stone or glass or painted ceramic. And so it creates, these little tesserae reflect light and create a kind of shimmering effect when they're in a certain kind of light. And this is an art form that really begins to take off in the Hellenistic period. All right. What I want to talk about is, what kind of art really develops in the Hellenistic period. And of course, we want to pay attention to some of the ways in which Hellenistic art is in continuity with the classical Greek art that came before. But we'll also spend a lot of time looking at some of the divergences, both from an artistic and a thematic point of view. There's quite a bit of new territory that's covered by Hellenistic artists. So we're going to be especially sensitive to some of those differences. And we're going to start by looking at a couple of works of art, both architecture and sculpture, that are particularly representative of the Hellenistic period. And then we'll conclude with a kind of more systematic consideration of how the aesthetic and artistic values of the Hellenistic period departed from those of the classical period in some significant respects. So we'll just be looking at one work of architecture and sculpture, and that is the Great Altar of Zeus in Pergamon, which is in Western Asia Minor, what is today Western Turkey. This was considered one of the wonders of the ancient world. So this is a very famous work of art. It's possibly the what is referred to in Revelation 2:13 as Satan's throne. One of the most interesting things to do with the altar of Zeus, given what we've studied in this class, is to compare it to the most iconic classical Greek building, which is, of course, the Parthenon. And immediately we see some striking similarities. We see that you've got, a colonnade going all the way around the structure. We have a frieze that has been sculpted, and we'll talk more about that in just a moment. So there are several things that look very familiar, and the order of the altar of Zeus is, it's not the Doric order, which is the order of the Parthenon, but we know that there are several structures on the Acropolis that use the Ionic order. So this looks familiar to us, right? The little scrolls at the capitals and all of that. But if you look a little more closely, you'll see that in a lot of ways, the altar of Zeus is sort of like the Parthenon turned on its head in some ways. So, for instance, in the Parthenon, the sculpted frieze is, it's meant to be looked at, but it's not sort of the primary attraction in the way that the frieze of the altar of Zeus is. Likewise, with the Parthenon, the columns that make up the colonnade are playing an important structural function, that they're holding up the whole cornice and roof. But in the altar of Zeus, the columns and the cornice above them are really just sort of there for decoration, not really serving the same kind of functional purpose. So already clearly, architecture, Greek style architecture is moving into some new directions. Now I want to look more closely at that frieze, which is stunning in scale. It's 7 feet high. And of course, you can't see the backside of it, but it wraps all the way around the altar of Zeus, from the inside of, one side of the staircase to the inside of the other side of the staircase, which makes it about 450 feet long. So 7 feet by 450 feet. What it is depicting is a story, the story of the gods versus the giants, the Olympian gods versus the giants. Now, what we're looking at here has clearly been damaged, but we're looking at Athena. She is the main figure there. Athena slaying one of the giants named Alcyoneus. Don't worry about the name. And to her right, at least from our perspective, to her right, is Gaia, the goddess Gaia, who is the mother of Alcyoneus. And clearly Athena is prevailing in this particular contest. And what I want you to really note here is just, first of all, how busy the composition is. There is a lot going on here. There's lots of detail, and there's lots of suggested motion. One of the ways the illusion of motion is created is with all those sort of diagonal lines you can see most dramatically with the leg of Alcyoneus. It's also a high relief carving, which imparts a great deal of drama to it. It's theatrical, it's melodramatic, even though her face has been damaged. If you look at Gaia, her eyes are so sort of plaintive, and she's clearly, desperately pleading for the life of her son. So we've got pathos, we've got drama, we've got action and excitement. And I just want to take a moment and compare this particular panel with another high relief sculpture found in a frieze, this time the Parthenon, and that is the Lapith and Centaur, which hopefully you will remember. It's not been that long since you looked at it. And that's a fight scene as well, but it's really a study in contrast, because if you look at the Lapith and the Centaur, it almost looks like they're kind of posing for the sculptor. You don't really have this sense of frenzied action that you do in the altar of Zeus. And you also have a much less cluttered kind of composition. There's much less kind of visual detail and information to take in. So this is an example of how, we move from this sort of very stately kind of sculpture in the classical period to a much more kind of dynamic, dramatic, even frenetic action in Hellenistic sculpture. All right, so from this point on, we're just going to be looking at sculptures, non-architectural sculptures, starting with the boxer. And of course, we have to use our imagination to supply the context. Is this right before a boxing match? Is it right after? Uh, Either way, I think it should be clear that we're many, many miles removed at this point from sort of classical Greek idealism. Okay, if you think about the discus thrower, or if you think about the spear bearer, um, classical Greeks love to depict athletes, but they love to depict athletes in the prime of their lives, in a moment of poise and confidence and command. And of course, I think it's safe to say that that is not the vibe that is emanating from our boxer. I mean, starting with the mere fact that he is seated rather than sort of standing up, in command of his own domain. And he's not just seated, he is slouching, right? Slouching. He's also a bit older than the typical figure that would be depicted in a classical Greek statue. Now I want to look at a close-up of his face, okay? Several of those sort of scars that you can see there, that's not just damage that happened later on. That is actually original to the sculpture. The artist put those there. And even some of that discoloration that you see there, that is original to the sculpture and was in fact meant to suggest blood. Okay, so very much lends credence to the idea that this is after a moment after the match that is being depicted here. And so if you sort of add all this up, the fact that he's seated, his posture, the state of his nose, the scarring, it all sort of adds up to failure and defeat. And that, of course, is in violation of classical Greek idealism, where you show human beings at their peak. And, maybe when, in the past, he was a great boxer, but he's past his prime and he is coming to terms with that. So this kind of depiction, it was really kind of out of bounds in the classical period. But in the Hellenistic period, there's going to be much more interest in people or in periods of life that are far from ideal. Speaking of which, we're going to move on to Laocoon and his two sons. Now, this is actually a great example of how Hellenistic art both sort of built on classical precursors and departed from them. Now, first of all, I probably should say something about the fact that here is a man and his two sons being attacked by serpents. That might seem to be a strange thing to be depicting, but this is a story you're actually going to be reading about for class very soon when we read the Aeneid. So I'm not going to spoil that for you. For now, just accept the fact that these are killer snakes and they're attacking poor Laocoon and his two sons. Well, what did I mean by saying this is a great example of how Hellenistic art built on classical models and then departed from them? Well, look at the physique of Laocoon. For one thing, it is incredibly impressively sculpted in a very realistic way. The treatment of musculature and bones and veins and all of that highly realistic. Okay? Is also idealistic in the sense that Laocoon is a pretty impressive specimen. Okay, he really seems to have honed and toned his physique to its maximum potential. But of course, what's not ideal is the fact that he is being devoured by snakes. And if you look at his facial expression, if you look at the kind of violent tilt of his head, again, this is the kind of scene that classical Greek sculptors avoided because it is a depiction of suffering, of despair, of defeat. There's a detail of his head, and you can see just at what an acute angle it's tilted. And again, you can look at the furrowed brow, and there's that show of emotion. I mean, if you think back to classical Greek sculpture, there's just really no emotion shown at all. And that was the ideal, right? Because the ideal is that our emotions are held in check by reason. But Laocoon is sort of past that point, and his emotions have begun to take over. All right, a very different, just, yeah, as a point of comparison, that's the spear bearer or the Doryphorus on the right. And again, I mean, just sort of typifying that classical Greek sense of perfection and mastery and kind of emotional control. So it's a real study in contrast there. All right. Well, we move on to a very different piece of Hellenistic sculpture. This is not necessarily one, in fact, it's got nothing to do with defeat or suffering, quite the opposite, because this is a depiction of the goddess Nike, which means victory in Greek. This is a view from the front. I want to give you also a view from the side so you can see the sort of dramatic drapery and the way in which the artist has just created this amazing sense that the wind is sort of blowing against Nike, and that she, is capturing that moment, that split second, as she sort of lands on Earth. Okay, so capturing this highly dramatic moment. So again, even though it's not a depiction of suffering or failure or lack of control, loss of control, the dynamism and the dramatic nature of this work really do kind of mark it out as Hellenistic. I should also mention the size. It's about 9 feet tall, so larger than life, which of course only amplifies the drama of the moment. Okay. So got a little sampling now of Hellenistic art, and we're going to look at 1 or 2 additional works, but we're going to do that in the context of comparing classical and Hellenistic artistic values. And I've already started to do that some. So some of this will be review, some of it won't. The first thing that I would say is that if classical Greek art could be described as kind of humanistic in the sense that it was trying to make a statement about human nature rather than trying to sort of create or depict specific individuals. That's classical Greek art. Hellenistic art is going to be much more preoccupied with the individual, less concerned with sort of what all humans may have in common, more concerned about sort of capturing an individual personality or figure. So in classical art, we get a lot of sort of very ideal types. In fact, we go back for a second. If you look at the spear bearer there on the right, He just doesn't really have a personality. There's nothing particularly individual and distinct about him. He's more just sort of emblematic of, the human person at his peak, right? But what we get in the Hellenistic period is the creation of very sort of distinctive individuals. So if you look at this statue of Demosthenes here, I think you get a good sense of that. Demosthenes does not just look like, a sort of classical Greek mannequin, but he looks like, somebody's uncle, somebody's friend. He has this very kind of distinctive quality to him, that is distinctively Hellenistic. And this reflects kind of in many ways what's going on in the Hellenistic world as the polis is less and less important, and you have all these large scale kingdoms that take root in the wake of Alexander the Great. So there's more of an emphasis just generally in culture on the individual more than the collective. Oh, this is a slide that really, I think, illustrates pretty dramatically and vividly what I'm talking about. So on the left, that's the Critias boy, very early classical Greek sculpture. In many ways, very naturalistic, very realistic, and all of that. But also kind of vacant, kind of devoid of individual personality or distinctiveness. And if you look at Demosthenes, the Hellenistic work, it's also very realistic if you look at the drapery or the anatomy and all that. But what you have in addition to that is, a person with distinctive facial features, which gives him a distinctive personality. So individualism, that is a term, a concept that I want you to correlate with the Hellenistic period. Another contrast, which is one I have touched on, and that is sort of realism versus idealism. So we kind of see that here, actually, in the contrast between these two works. In the classical period, it was all about idealism, showing people at their peak, showing people in control, showing people in their youth, when the world is at their feet. Obviously, you look at Demosthenes, and he is someone who is not only much older than the Critias boy, but the lines on his face, tell a story, and they show, what age and worry and anxiety, do to us. So there's that realism there rather than the idealism we see with the Critias boy or the discus thrower or the spear bearer, or so on. People can be depicted in the Hellenistic period at vulnerable moments of their life and in moments of defeat, because that's what life is like, right? Life is about dealing with defeat and suffering, and that's what Hellenistic artists were really concerned with. Two other quick points, both of which have been touched on. If classical Greek art is characterized by emotional restraint and simplicity, Hellenistic art is often linked with sort of emotional display. And just as, again, another, oh, I'm sorry, I thought I had the slide there, but it's okay. You've just seen both of these, so you can do this. If you think about the spear bearer, the classical piece, and then think back to Laocoon, right, who's being devoured by snakes. We've already touched on that, so I don't need to belabor that point. But that's one significant difference between classical and Hellenistic. To what extent are emotions shown, and those emotions are often negative emotions, as we saw with Laocoon. Okay, finally, and this will bring us to our last artwork, what we see as the ideal in classical Greek art, which was idealistic, is rest, poise, composure. Think about the Zeus Poseidon sculpture that we saw. It's someone sort of, feet planted firmly on the ground, in command of his surroundings. And in the Hellenistic period, there is much more of an inclination towards motion, action, capturing a dramatic moment. And we can see this even in examples perhaps less dramatic than the Venus de Milo. I'm sorry, than the winged Victory or winged Nike. We can see this in the Venus de Milo or Aphrodite of Melos, goes by both names. Now, this is not capturing, a dramatic moment necessarily, but it is a kind of dramatic example of something we saw in classical sculpture, which was the contrapposto stance. Okay? The contrapposto stance is the stance in which more weight is being put on one leg, and therefore the other leg is more relaxed, and it creates a kind of S curve in the figure. But what we see here with the Venus de Milo is a really, really exaggerated contrapposto. I mean, so exaggerated, it's like the first thing you notice, right? Is that sort of torque of her body, almost suggesting a kind of motion as if she's kind of swiveling to turn and face someone else. So again, suggesting that illusion of movement or motion is something typical of Hellenistic, but something we saw very little of at all in classical Greek art. Okay, I hope that gives you a good, solid sense of how, again, Hellenistic artists were building on their classical predecessors, but using some of those tools for very different ends. All right, have a good one.